What if the system wasn't broken, but designed to protect the guilty? A young attorney takes on a corrupt police force, only to find himself hunted, framed, and forced into a deadly game of power. The deeper he digs, the more dangerous it gets. But when the truth is this big, staying silent is not an option. How far would you go for justice? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. The city had long since settled into the quiet lull of late evening, the hum of traffic fading as most people retreated into the warmth of their homes. Minneapolis, a city James Carter once loved for its energy and ambition, now felt like a battleground. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken tension, one that had existed long before him but had grown heavier in recent years. James sat alone in his car, the dashboard clock glowing a faint blue. 10:17 p.m. Another late night at the office. Another day spent piecing together a case that had the potential to shake the Minneapolis Police Department to its core. He rolled his shoulders, exhaustion creeping in, but his mind refused to rest. The lawsuit had consumed him. He had spent months interviewing victims, combing through reports, and building a case that could finally hold the department accountable for years of unchecked power. It was the kind of fight his father had warned him about. The kind that turned men into targets. Outside, the city stretched out in long, empty streets, dimly lit by streetlights that flickered against the damp pavement. The rain from earlier had left everything slick, a sheen of water reflecting neon signs and traffic signals. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly as he pulled away from the curb outside his office. The moment he turned onto the main road, a creeping unease settled in his chest. He couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then he saw them. A pair of headlights trailing behind him. A police cruiser. It wasn't speeding to an emergency. It wasn't pulling up to a red light. It was simply there, following, maintaining a careful distance. James's fingers curled around the wheel. He kept his speed exactly at the limit, signaled every turn, obeyed every traffic rule like he was taking a driver's test all over again. There was no reason for them to stop him. None. But they stayed. His father's voice echoed in his mind. A memory from years ago, spoken in the deep, steady tone he always used when trying to drill something important into James's head. It doesn't matter how well you follow the law, son. Some of them don't see a lawyer when they look at you. They see what they want to see. James's jaw clenched. He had spent his life fighting that idea. He had worked twice as hard, stayed twice as clean. He graduated top of his class, made a name for himself in civil rights law, and ensured that his reputation was untouchable. But now, as he stared into the rearview mirror at the steady blue and red glow behind him, he realized something chilling. It still didn't matter. They were following him. His apartment wasn't far, just a few turns away. He told himself to stay calm, to not let paranoia take hold. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was imagining things. But when he made a left onto his street, another squad car sat at the intersection, parked sideways across the road. His breath caught in his throat. They were waiting for him. James's pulse pounded as he slowed the car to a stop. His mind raced through every possible explanation. He hadn't done anything wrong. There was no warrant for his arrest. No reason. No justification. The speaker on the parked police cruiser crackled to life. Step out of the vehicle. Now. The words sent an icy chill down his spine. James didn't move right away. He scanned the area, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. The street was too quiet. The shops along the sidewalk had already closed for the night. No pedestrians, no witnesses. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. The officer on the speaker repeated the command. Sharper this time. Step out of the car with your hands where we can see them. James swallowed hard, forcing himself to think. If he refused, they would escalate. If he argued, they could twist his words. This was exactly what his case was about. He exhaled through his nose and slowly reached for the door handle. James kept his hands on the steering wheel, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The flashing lights bathed the interior of his car in an eerie red and blue glow. Outside, the sound of boots scraping against asphalt grew louder. He could see their shadows first. Two figures approaching from either side. One moving with casual authority, the other with hesitant steps. When the taller man stepped fully into view, James recognized him instantly. Mark Reynolds. The name was familiar, not just from the lawsuit, but from years of complaints, whispered warnings, and news articles that never led to consequences. Reynolds had built a career on intimidation. He had been accused of excessive force multiple times, yet remained on the force. Lawsuits were settled quietly. Internal investigations led nowhere. And now, here he was, standing outside James's car, fingers resting lightly on his duty belt, just inches from his holstered gun. On the other side, the younger officer, Eric Nolan, shifted his weight uncomfortably. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't relaxed either. He looked like someone who had been told what to do but wasn't entirely sure he wanted to do it. Reynolds leaned down, his expression unreadable. Step out of the vehicle. James didn't move. He kept his voice calm. What's the reason for the stop, officer? Reynolds exhaled slowly, like a man whose patience was wearing thin. Step out of the car, he repeated, his voice harder this time. James glanced at Nolan, who avoided eye contact. A bad sign. He looked back at Reynolds. Unless you have probable cause, I don't have to get out of my car. A slow smirk crept across Reynolds's face, but there was no humor in it. You're a lawyer, right? James didn't answer. Reynolds tapped the roof of the car twice. Then you should know how this works. You can step out willingly, or I can charge you with obstruction and drag you out myself. Your choice. James's jaw tightened. He knew his rights. He knew this was wrong. But he also knew how these situations could spiral. He could argue, escalate, and end up in cuffs, or worse. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The cold night air hit him as he stepped out. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken. Reynolds stepped closer, invading his space. Turn around, hands on the car. James didn't move. Am I under arrest? Reynolds tilted his head, pretending to consider it. Not yet. Before James could say anything else, Reynolds grabbed his arm, spun him around, and shoved him against the car. The impact wasn't violent, but it wasn't gentle either. A calculated display of dominance. James clenched his jaw. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. Across the street, a couple of people had stopped to watch. A flicker of movement. Someone raising a phone. Reynolds either didn't notice or didn't care. He patted James down with rough efficiency, as if hoping to find something. Some excuse to turn this into an arrest. On the other side of the car, Nolan shifted uncomfortably. Lieutenant, Reynolds cut him off. Stay where you are. James took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen this play out before. If he reacted, if he resisted, it would give them exactly what they wanted. Reynolds stepped back, popped the trunk. James turned his head. You don't have a warrant. Reynolds's smirk returned. And yet, here we are. Before James could protest, Reynolds yanked open the car door and reached inside, unlocking the trunk himself. James clenched his fists. This was illegal. He knew it. Reynolds knew it. But what could he do? File a complaint? Add his name to the long list of people who had tried and failed to hold this man accountable? Reynolds rummaged through the trunk, lifting a briefcase, checking under the spare tire compartment. When he found nothing, his smirk faded. He slammed the trunk shut and turned back to James. Consider this a friendly warning. James stared at him. Warning for what? Reynolds leaned in slightly. Stay in your lane, Carter. Some fights aren't worth picking. James held his gaze, refusing to look away first. Reynolds chuckled under his breath. He patted James's shoulder twice, mocking, condescending, then stepped back. You're free to go. James exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing. He got back into the car, his hands steady as he gripped the wheel. As he pulled away, he saw Nolan hesitate for just a second, like he wanted to say something. But then Reynolds clapped him on the back, and whatever was in his eyes disappeared. James drove in silence. His mind wasn't on the road anymore. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. A text message. No name, no number, just a single line. Stop before it's too late. We know who you are. The morning sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Minneapolis. But James felt no warmth from it. The events of the previous night still clung to him like a heavy coat. The unwanted traffic stop, the illegal search, Reynolds's smug warning. And the text message. A single sentence that had sent a chill down his spine. Stop before it's too late. We know who you are. He had spent years dealing with intimidation tactics. But this felt different. It was direct, personal, a reminder that no matter how much he thought he understood the system, it still had ways of reminding him who really held the power. As he pulled into the parking lot outside his office, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. If they thought they could scare him, they were wrong. Inside, his assistant, Lillian, greeted him with her usual efficiency. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when something was off. You look like you didn't sleep, she observed. I didn't, James admitted. I need you to draft a formal complaint. Internal affairs. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't hesitate. The stop last night? He nodded. Reynolds and Nolan. Illegal search. Harassment. Intimidation. Everything documented. She didn't question him further. Just turned to her computer and started typing. That was one of the things he appreciated about her. She didn't waste time on unnecessary words. An hour later, James was on the phone with the Internal Affairs Division of the Minneapolis Police Department. The hold music was scratchy. The kind of generic tune meant to make waiting less unbearable but instead only heightened his irritation. Finally, a voice came on the line. This is Lieutenant Derek Simmons. Internal Affairs. How can I help you? James kept his tone controlled. I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding an unlawful stop and search conducted by Lieutenant Mark Reynolds last night. There was a pause. Too long to be normal. Reynolds, you said? Simmons's voice was calm, unreadable. Yes. Another pause. James could almost hear the gears turning on the other end. I'm afraid we can't move forward without substantial evidence. Simmons finally said. James's grip on the phone tightened. Are you telling me that dashcam footage, officer body cameras, and my own statement aren't enough to start an investigation? I'm telling you, Simmons replied smoothly, that unless you can provide clear proof of misconduct, there's no case to be opened. James exhaled through his nose. He had expected resistance, but not this quickly, not this blatant. Let me be clear, he said, voice measured. I'm not dropping this. Simmons didn't sound remotely concerned. That's your right, Mr. Carter. Have a good day. The line went dead. James set the phone down carefully. He had barely even started pushing, and already the doors were slamming shut. As he left his office an hour later, his thoughts were still turning over the conversation when something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A police cruiser, idling at the corner. Watching. James felt his stomach tighten. He shook it off and got into his car. He wasn't going to let paranoia take over. He had work to do. But as he made his way toward his next meeting, he saw the cruiser again. A different street, same distance, same careful shadowing. It wasn't paranoia. They were watching him. When he turned into the parking garage beneath his office building, the cruiser followed. James pulled into his usual spot, gripping the wheel for a second longer than necessary. He checked his mirrors. The squad car had stopped near the entrance. A different officer this time. Not Reynolds. For a brief moment, James thought about ignoring it, walking upstairs like nothing was wrong. Then the cruiser's lights flicked on. He sighed. So this was how they wanted to play it. He rolled down his window as the officer approached. Step out of the vehicle. Please, the cop said. His badge read Officer Carter. An ironic coincidence that did nothing to ease James's tension. James kept his tone calm. What's the reason for the stop? Officer Carter didn't flinch. Routine check. James let out a slow breath. That's not a real reason. The officer didn't budge. Step out of the car. James debated his options. Cause a scene in the middle of a public parking garage? Argue and let them twist his words? Or comply and see exactly what game they were playing? He chose the last option. As soon as he stepped out, the officer moved to the back of his car. Pop the trunk. James crossed his arms. Not without a warrant. Officer Carter didn't even pretend to acknowledge the law. He simply reached for the trunk release and yanked it open. James's stomach dropped. There, sitting in plain view among his briefcase and gym bag, was a small plastic bag filled with white powder. He froze. Every instinct screamed at him. He hadn't seen that bag before. It wasn't his. And yet, here it was. Officer Carter exhaled through his nose. shaking his head like he had just made an unfortunate discovery. Well, looks like we got ourselves a problem. James's mind raced. He needed to think. He needed to act. This is a setup, he said, keeping his voice level. The officer didn't even blink. You have the right to remain silent. James lifted his chin. I want my lawyer. Officer Carter smirked. You're a lawyer, aren't you? James didn't answer. The cuffs went around his wrists, cold metal biting into his skin. As they led him toward the squad car, he looked up and saw Reynolds standing in the distance, arms crossed, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. And James knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. James sat in the small, windowless room, his wrists sore from the cuffs that had only recently been removed. The walls were a dull gray, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee. A single flickering light overhead cast long shadows, making the already cramped space feel even smaller. Across from him, a steel door remained shut, its handle unmoving. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. He had been here for nearly an hour with no explanation, no phone call, and no indication of what was to come. His pulse was steady, but his mind was anything but. He had been in enough courtrooms to know how the system worked. They were playing a game. Delay, isolate, wear him down. Finally, the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, dressed in a crisp button-down with sleeves rolled to his elbows. Lieutenant Derek Simmons, Internal Affairs. His reputation was well-known, efficient, methodical, and dangerously indifferent. If there was corruption in the department, Simmons wasn't just aware of it, he was part of it. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he moved slowly, almost lazily, to the other side of the table, setting a thin manila folder down between them. He tapped it once, as if to remind James it was there, then took a seat. Long night? Simmons asked, his tone almost conversational. James didn't answer. Simmons sighed as if disappointed. I assume you'd like to speak to a lawyer. James met his gaze. That's right. Simmons tilted his head slightly. Well, here's the thing. You're not under arrest. Not officially. Just a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. James's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. You planted evidence in my car. You illegally detained me. And now you're trying to keep me here without cause. Simmons smiled, slow and deliberate. I can keep you here for hours without violating protocol. That's just how the system works. James knew the law inside and out. Simmons wasn't lying. They could hold him under the pretense of questioning long enough to make a point. James leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression unreadable. What exactly do you want from me? Simmons didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped open the folder, revealing a single piece of paper. He slid it across the table. James glanced down. His own name was printed at the top. A list of dates, case numbers, the lawsuit he was building against MPD. His stomach tightened. You think you're in control here? Simmons said, watching him closely. You're not. James lifted his eyes. Neither are you. For the first time, Simmons's expression flickered, something unreadable passing through his gaze. But before he could respond, the door opened again. A uniformed officer stepped inside. Sir, there's someone asking for him. Simmons didn't look away from James. Who? Journalist. Maya Lopez. James's heart jumped. Simmons exhaled sharply, pushing his chair back. Tell her there's no record of him being here. The officer hesitated. She's persistent. Simmons ran a hand over his jaw. Clearly irritated, he stood and adjusted his sleeves. Tell her to come back with a warrant. The officer nodded and left. James took a slow breath. At least someone knew he was missing. Simmons turned back to him, shaking his head like a teacher dealing with an unruly student. You see, Carter, this is the problem. You've been making too much noise. People are starting to notice. James didn't respond. Simmons leaned on the table, lowering his voice. You think you're fighting Reynolds. But this isn't about one cop. You're stepping on the wrong toes. And if you keep pushing, I guarantee you won't like where this ends. James held his gaze, refusing to look away. A slow smile spread across Simmons's face. He straightened, adjusted his collar, then turned toward the door. Enjoy your stay, he said, then walked out, leaving James alone again. The door clicked shut. He exhaled, pressing his palms against the cool surface of the table. His body was still, but his mind was racing. They were scared. That meant he was getting close. A few minutes passed before he heard another knock. James looked up as the door opened just enough for a different officer to slip inside. Young, dark skin, nervous eyes. Marcus Hill. He shut the door behind him quickly, glancing toward the security camera in the corner. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You're in deep, man. They're not gonna let this go." James studied him. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus shifted his weight. "Because you're not the only one they've done this to." James narrowed his eyes. "You have proof?" Marcus hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. James unfolded it. A case number. No name. Just a number. Marcus's voice was barely audible. "It's a file they don't want anyone to see. If you can get to it, you'll understand everything." James stared at the paper, his pulse quickening. Before he could say anything, footsteps echoed in the hall. Marcus straightened immediately, stepping back toward the door. A second later, it swung open. Reynolds stepped inside, his expression as smug as ever. "Well," he said, his tone almost amused, "I hope you're enjoying our hospitality, Carter." James tucked the paper into his fist, keeping his expression blank. Reynolds leaned against the doorframe. "You have two options. Drop the case, walk away, go back to playing lawyer in a world that doesn't care. Or," he let the sentence hang. James didn't flinch. "Or what?" Reynolds's smirk widened. "Or I make sure you never practice law again." James felt his jaw tighten. But he didn't speak. Reynolds pushed off the doorframe, adjusting his badge. "Think about it. You've got time." Then he walked out, leaving James alone again. James stared at the door long after it shut, his grip tightening around the paper in his hand. He wasn't going to walk away. Not now. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell flickered, casting pale, uneven shadows across the concrete walls. James sat on the cold metal bench, exhaustion pulling at his body. But his mind was still sharp. 12 hours. 12 hours of silence, waiting, and carefully calculated psychological warfare. They hadn't charged him, hadn't allowed him to make a call, and no one had come to check on him. It was a waiting game, one designed to make him question, to make him second-guess his own decisions. But James wasn't new to this. He had seen tactics like this play out before, just never from this side of the table. Finally, the heavy steel door creaked open. An officer he didn't recognize stepped in, unlocking the cuffs from the bench. "You're free to go," the man said without looking at him. James stood slowly, stretching out his stiff limbs. "No charges?" he asked. The officer didn't answer, just gestured toward the door. James didn't need to be told twice. He stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, the faint scent of burnt coffee and old paper filling his lungs. His steps echoed as he walked toward the exit. When he finally pushed through the last set of doors into the cold morning air, he stopped short. A small group of reporters stood just beyond the station steps. They weren't asking questions, weren't rushing toward him, shoving microphones in his face. Instead, they stood there, waiting, silent. James scanned the crowd. Something was off. Then he realized what it was. No cameras, no news vans, just a few local reporters watching him, hesitant, unsure of whether this was a story they were even allowed to cover. And just like that, it became clear. Someone was controlling the narrative. Before he could process it, Maya Lopez broke through the small crowd, her expression a mixture of relief and urgency. "Are you okay?" she asked, searching his face. James exhaled. "They're trying to shut me up." Maya's jaw tightened. "They wiped you from the system." James frowned. "I called every precinct last night." She continued. "There was no record of your arrest. No paperwork. It was like you were never here." James let that sink in. Maya leaned in, lowering her voice. "They're not just trying to intimidate you, James. They're trying to erase you." James nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he refused to show it. "They can try," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's fight." James didn't waste any more time. He needed to get back to his office. The familiar walls of his law firm should have felt safe. But today they felt suffocating. His colleagues watched him carefully as he walked through the doors. The tension in the room was tangible. When he stepped into the conference room, his longtime friend and fellow attorney, David Holt, was already waiting. The older man, usually composed and pragmatic, looked deeply concerned. "You're making enemies you can't afford to have, James," David said before James even had a chance to sit down. James placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. "They detained me illegally. We have a case." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "A case against the MPD? You think that's going to go anywhere?" James's eyes hardened. "It has to." David hesitated before shaking his head. "Look, I respect what you're trying to do. But this isn't just about one bad cop anymore. They're playing a different game now. You need to think long-term." James met his gaze. "You're saying I should back off?" "I'm saying they can destroy you," David said quietly. "Your career, your credibility, your life." James let the words settle between them. "I can't walk away from this," he said finally. David exhaled, looking at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, but his face carried a warning. "Then be ready," he said, "because they're going to hit back." Later that evening, James sat alone in his office, staring at the piece of paper Marcus Hill had slipped him. The case number, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he searched the public records database. Nothing. He tried another system. Still nothing. They had erased it. Or at least, they had tried to. He picked up his phone and dialed. Marcus answered on the second ring. "We need to talk," James said. Marcus hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Meet me in an hour. Same place as before." James grabbed his coat and left. The coffee shop was nearly empty, the warm scent of roasted beans lingering in the air. Marcus sat in the farthest booth, his shoulders tense, eyes scanning the room. James slid into the seat across from him. Marcus didn't waste time. "That file," Marcus said, voice low. "It's connected to a case from 10 years ago. A murder." James's brows furrowed. "And Reynolds was involved?" Marcus nodded. "He was the lead investigator. The case disappeared after a few months. No conviction. No record." James leaned forward. "And you have access to it?" Marcus hesitated. "Not exactly, but someone I know kept a copy. Off the books." James's pulse quickened. "I need that file," he said. Marcus exhaled. "I'll see what I can do." James nodded, but before he could say anything else, Marcus's eyes flicked over his shoulder. "Don't turn around," Marcus muttered. James stiffened. "What? We're being watched." James didn't move, didn't react. "Dark sedan," Marcus continued. "No plates." James clenched his jaw. "They're not waiting," Marcus said, voice tense. "They're moving." James stood abruptly. "We need to go." They rushed toward the back exit. But before they could make it, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. James turned just in time to see a car speeding toward them. The impact was instant, a violent, shattering force. Then, darkness. The taste of blood filled James's mouth as consciousness returned in fragments. His head throbbed. Something warm trickled down his forehead. He forced his eyes open. Through the cracked windshield, he saw boots crunching against broken glass. A shadow loomed over him. Then, a voice. Cold, familiar. "I warned you, Carter," Reynolds said, "but you didn't listen." James's breath came in ragged gasps. He tried to move, but pain shot through his ribs. Reynolds crouched beside the wreckage, tilting his head. "You really should have listened." James clenched his teeth, forcing himself to meet Reynolds's gaze. He wasn't done yet. Not even close. James drifted in and out of consciousness, the steady beeping of a heart monitor pulling him toward awareness. His head throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache, and the sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils. He forced his eyes open, the harsh fluorescent light making him wince. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar. White walls, the hum of machines, a hospital. His fingers twitched as he tried to sit up, but a dull pain shot through his ribs, forcing him to stop. A bandage was wrapped around his head. His arms were sore, purple bruises already forming along his skin. He let out a slow breath, the memories of the crash rushing back in fragments. The screech of tires, The brutal impact, the sensation of being thrown sideways. And then, Reynolds, standing over him, that cold stare, that voice laced with amusement. James clenched his fists. A soft knock at the door made him turn his head. Maya Lopez stepped inside, her expression tense. She wore a dark jacket over a simple blouse. Her press badge still clipped to her belt. Her eyes scanned the room, checking the corners before finally meeting his gaze. She shut the door quietly behind her and approached his bedside, leaning in just enough so only he could hear. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered. "They tried to kill you." James let out a slow, steady breath. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it real. Maya glanced toward the door before speaking again. "They filed the report as a traffic accident. No mention of another vehicle. No mention of you being followed." James swallowed the anger rising in his throat. "Of course they did." Maya hesitated, then pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. "I checked security footage from a nearby building. Your crash wasn't random. The second car hit you on purpose, then disappeared before the police arrived." James stared at the grainy footage. He could barely make out the shadowy shape of the other vehicle. But it was enough. "They're getting desperate," Maya said, "which means you're close to something they don't want you to find." James didn't have time to respond before his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, wincing as his muscles protested. Marcus Hill's name flashed on the screen. James answered, bringing the phone to his ear. "Marcus, you have to stop." Marcus's voice came through, low and frantic. "They know I helped you." James's fingers tightened around the device. "Are you safe?" "For now," Marcus said, "but that won't last." There was a pause, then a sharp breath. "I can't do this anymore. James, they're watching me." James sat up straighter despite the pain. "Marcus, listen to me. We can expose them, but I need more. That file, it's gone." Marcus cut him off. "I had a copy, but they found out. I don't know how, but they wiped it." James's chest tightened. That was their game. Erase the evidence. Silence the witnesses. Bury the past. There's one person who might still have proof. Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower. "Evelyn Harper." James frowned. "The federal judge? She was involved in the case 10 years ago. She tried to push for an indictment, but the charges never stuck. If anyone knows what really happened, it's her." James ran a hand over his face. Evelyn Harper had a reputation for being fair but relentless. If she had seen something back then, she wouldn't have let it go easily. "Where can I find her?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "That's the problem. She left town a few days ago. No explanation. No one knows where she went." A cold weight settled in James's stomach. They had gotten to her. Or worse. A sharp noise came through the line. A door opening. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "I have to go." The call ended. James stared at the screen, his mind racing. They were erasing everything, evidence, witnesses, even the people who had tried to do the right thing. Maya's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to move fast." James nodded, pushing back the blanket. "Help me get out of here." "You should rest," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. They both knew he wouldn't. "I don't have time to rest," James muttered. Maya exhaled but didn't argue. "Then let's get to work." 2 hours later, James sat at his desk, painkillers dulling the worst of his aches but doing nothing to silence his mind. His office was dimly lit, only the glow of his laptop illuminating the room. Maya sat across from him, scrolling through her own research. "I checked Judge Harper's last few rulings," she said, "nothing out of the ordinary." But then, she turned her screen toward him. "I found this." It was a news article. A local report from years ago. A routine conviction overturned due to procedural errors. The presiding judge? Evelyn Harper. James's eyes narrowed. Who was the defendant? Maya clicked the link. A mugshot appeared on the screen. Daniel Briggs. James sat back. "Briggs is one of the officers named in the lawsuit," Maya said, "and 10 years ago, he worked with Reynolds." James exhaled slowly. Pieces were falling into place. Reynolds, Briggs, Harper, whatever had happened back then, it had been big enough to bury. And now, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. Before he could say anything, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. James hesitated. then answered. A distorted voice spoke. Go home. James's muscles tensed. Who is this? Silence. Then, you've been warned. The line went dead. James lowered the phone, his jaw tight. Maya watched him carefully. What did they say? He stood, reaching for his keys. I need to check something. Maya followed him toward the door. James. But he was already gone. The moment James stepped into his apartment, he knew something was wrong. The door was locked, but the air felt different. Still, unnatural. His fingers hovered over the light switch before he decided against it. He moved cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then he saw it. The drawers in his desk were open. Papers scattered. His bookshelf had been rifled through. A chair knocked over. And on the far wall, painted in bold, dripping letters, "You've been warned." A chill ran down James's spine. This wasn't just a message. It was a promise. James sat in his darkened apartment. The words scrawled on the wall still burning in his mind. The paint had dried. The warning permanent. Someone had been here. Someone had rifled through his things, left a message, and disappeared without a trace. The fear was there, lingering just beneath the surface. But James didn't have the luxury of giving in to it. They wanted him to back down. They wanted him to disappear. But if they thought he was going to run, they had underestimated him. Maya's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Steady but tense. You're sure about this? James leaned against the counter, one hand gripping the edge. They're controlling the narrative. If we don't get ahead of this, they'll bury me before I can fight back. There was a pause. All right, Maya said. I'll set it up. James exhaled slowly. He knew what he was doing. Going public was risky. It would make him an even bigger target. But it was also his best chance of survival. They thrived in the shadows. He was going to drag them into the light. The newsroom bustled with quiet urgency. A controlled chaos of reporters, producers, and camera operators moving in perfect rhythm. James sat in the green room, the hum of the television filling the silence. The screen flickered with breaking news updates. None of them about him. Not yet. Maya appeared in the doorway, her press badge clipped to her blazer. We're live in 5, she said, her voice unreadable. James nodded, smoothing the wrinkles from his sleeves. He wasn't nervous. This was just another courtroom, except this time the jury was the entire country. The anchor greeted him with a practiced smile as he took his seat across from her. The cameras adjusted. The countdown began. And then, we're joined tonight by James Carter, a civil rights attorney currently at the center of a growing controversy with the Minneapolis Police Department. Mr. Carter, let's start with your arrest. Can you explain what happened? James met her gaze. I was stopped without cause. They searched my car without a warrant. And when they didn't find what they wanted, they planted evidence. The anchor leaned forward slightly. You're saying the drugs in your car weren't yours? James's expression didn't waver. I've spent my entire career fighting for justice. Do you really think I'd be careless enough to leave something illegal in my own vehicle? A murmur rippled through the studio. James continued, his voice steady. This wasn't about drugs. It was about silencing me. I'm leading a lawsuit against MPD for civil rights violations. That lawsuit threatens people in power. And now, suddenly, I'm being followed, detained without reason, and framed? The anchor hesitated, but James pressed on. They aren't just trying to intimidate me. They tried to kill me. The silence in the studio deepened. James turned toward the camera. If I had died in that crash, it would have been written off as an accident. No investigation, no questions asked, and it's not just me. How many others have they buried the same way? The anchor shifted in her seat, regaining her composure. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. James didn't blink, and I have the scars to prove it. The fallout was immediate. By the time James left the studio, the internet had exploded. Clips of his interview flooded social media. Debates ignited on news panels. And his name trended within hours. But the pushback came just as fast. By morning, MPD had scheduled their own press conference. James watched from his office as Reynolds stood at the podium. His uniform crisp, his posture rigid, the perfect image of a dedicated officer. It's disappointing, Reynolds said, his voice thick with false sincerity, to see someone attempt to undermine the hard work of this department with baseless accusations. James clenched his jaw. Reynolds continued, "Mr. Carter has chosen to wage a public campaign against law enforcement, distorting the facts to fit his agenda." Then came the real attack. "We have obtained footage from a recent encounter in which Mr. Carter displayed aggressive behavior toward an officer." A video clip played. James felt his stomach drop. It was him, standing outside his car. His jaw tight, his posture tense. But the audio had been altered. His voice was clipped, rearranged, the words manipulated to make it seem like he was threatening Nolan during the initial stop. James swallowed the fury rising in his throat. This was how they worked. They didn't need the truth. They just needed a version of reality that was convenient. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I have the real files. Meet me, midnight, parking garage." James stared at the screen. Marcus. Or a trap. But at this point, he didn't have a choice. The underground parking garage was nearly silent, save for the occasional drip of water leaking from the cracked concrete ceiling. Fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows against the rows of parked cars. The air smelled of oil and damp cement, the kind of stale scent that lingered in places meant to be forgotten. James pulled his coat tighter around him as he stepped cautiously forward, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. His pulse was steady, but his instincts were sharp, scanning every movement, every corner. He wasn't naive enough to assume this meeting would be safe. Marcus Hill stood near the far end of the lot, his back pressed against a pillar. Even from a distance, James could tell something was wrong. Marcus was jittery, shifting his weight, his eyes darting toward every passing shadow. James slowed his pace, keeping his voice low as he approached. "You all right?" Marcus exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I shouldn't be here." "Then why are you?" Marcus hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He extended it toward James, his hand unsteady. "This is it," Marcus murmured. "A copy of the case file they tried to erase. Everything about Reynolds. Everything they don't want you to see." James took the drive, his fingers brushing against Marcus's. The man's skin was cold, clammy. Before James could ask anything else, a gunshot shattered the silence. Marcus's body jerked violently as a dark bloom of red spread across his chest. His mouth opened in a silent gasp, his legs giving out beneath him. James caught him before he hit the ground. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down, pressing his hand against the wound. Warm blood seeped through his fingers, pooling onto the concrete. Marcus's breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with pain. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. James leaned in closer. "Don't trust anyone," Marcus whispered. Then his body went still. James clenched his jaw, swallowing the burning rage rising in his chest. He barely had a moment to process before movement caught his eye. A shadow in the distance. Someone running. James's body tensed. His first instinct was to chase, but his rational mind held him back. This was a setup. If he stayed, they'd pin this on him. If he ran after the shooter, he'd be walking straight into another trap. His heart pounded as he looked down at Marcus's lifeless body, then at the USB drive still clutched in his fist. James did the only thing he could. He ran. The moment James stepped into his apartment, he locked the door behind him, chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. His clothes were stained with Marcus's blood, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He moved quickly, shedding his coat and shoving it into a plastic bag. He wiped down everything he had touched, every surface, every trace. Then he grabbed his laptop and plugged in the USB. A single encrypted folder appeared on the screen. James entered a few decryption keys he had used before, but nothing worked. His frustration mounted. After a few more failed attempts, the folder finally opened. Inside, there were dozens of files, documents, photos, and one audio recording. James clicked on it. A grainy voice filled the room. "This is Lieutenant Mark Reynolds. The job's done. No body, no witnesses. Just clean it up." James's blood ran cold. He played it again. No body, no witnesses. Reynolds wasn't just covering up crimes. He had been part of them. James scrolled through the documents, his eyes scanning rapidly until a name stopped him in his tracks. Evelyn Harper. The judge who had mysteriously disappeared. The one Marcus had told him to find. She had been involved in this case. And now, she was missing. James leaned back, his hands gripping the sides of the desk. This wasn't just about Reynolds. This was bigger. Much bigger. James sat at his desk, staring at the name on his screen. Judge Evelyn Harper, the only person who could verify what was on that USB. The only person left who might have answers. But according to her office, she was gone. The call had been brief. Too brief. "I'm sorry, but Judge Harper is unavailable," the secretary had said, her voice clipped, rehearsed. "She has taken an indefinite leave for personal reasons." James had pressed. "When did she leave? Where did she go?" The response was immediate. "I'm afraid I don't have that information." It was a lie. Maya sat across from him, her laptop open, fingers flying over the keyboard. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, eyes scanning the screen. She was in court just last week. No sign of her planning to leave. And then, nothing. James exhaled. "You think they got to her?" Maya looked up, meeting his gaze. "I think they scared her enough to disappear." James clenched his jaw. First Marcus, now Harper. The walls were closing in. And if he didn't move fast, he'd be next. He pushed back his chair and grabbed his coat. "I need to check her office." Maya frowned. "That's risky. Everything about this is risky." The courthouse was dark by the time James arrived. The night air sharp against his skin. Most of the staff had gone home, but the faint glow of security lights illuminated the hallways. Harper's office was on the third floor. The door was slightly ajar. James stilled. Every instinct told him to turn around, but he ignored it, stepping inside. The place was a mess. Papers were strewn across the floor. Filing cabinets left open. Drawers ransacked. The computer monitor was shattered. Wires hanging loose where the hard drive should have been. Whoever had been here wasn't looking for cash or valuables. They were looking for something specific. James scanned the room, his mind racing. If Harper had been planning to leave, she would have taken her most important documents with her. But if she had left in a hurry, his eyes landed on the desk. Carefully, he pulled open the bottom drawer. It was mostly empty, except for a single sheet of paper tucked beneath a legal pad. A handwritten note. James picked it up, heart pounding as he read. "If you're reading this, it means I am no longer safe. The truth isn't just in the files. Find Jonathan Fisk." James inhaled sharply. Fisk. Another name. Another missing piece. A noise outside made him freeze. Footsteps. James stuffed the note into his pocket and turned toward the door. The hallway was empty, but not for long. A car engine rumbled outside. James moved quickly, making his way down the staircase instead of the elevator. As he reached the side exit, he slowed, glancing through the glass pane in the door. A squad car idled in the lot, and stepping out of it, bathed in the harsh glow of the street lamp, was Mark Reynolds. James's pulse quickened. Reynolds took his time walking up to the entrance, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He wasn't here for an arrest. This was personal. James pushed open the door, stepping out onto the pavement. Reynolds stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly. "You just can't help yourself, can you, Carter?" His voice was almost amused. James stayed silent. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. "I've given you more warnings than most. And yet, here you are, snooping around places you don't belong." James took a step closer. "Where's Judge Harper?" Reynolds smirked. "You ask too many questions. You're running out of time." James shot back. "People are starting to see through your act." Reynolds chuckled. "Is that what you think? That an interview and a few bad headlines are going to change how this city works?" James clenched his fists. "I have proof. I know what you did. I know what's on that recording." Reynolds's smile faded. For the first time, there was something else in his eyes. Not amusement, not arrogance, just a flicker of something cold and dangerous. Then he exhaled, shaking his head again. "This is your last chance. Carter, walk away. Drop the case. Disappear while you still can." James felt the weight of the warning settle over him, but he didn't look away. Reynolds studied him for a moment longer, then turned back toward his car. As he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "Be smart," he said, voice lower now, or you won't like how this ends. Then he got in, the squad car pulling away into the darkness. James stood there for a long moment, the night air pressing in around him. He wasn't going to walk away. Not now. James stepped out of the elevator and into his office, already sensing something was wrong. The air was different, stale, heavy with the scent of something unnatural, burnt plastic. Maybe. Then he saw it. His desk drawers were pulled open, papers strewn across the floor. His bookshelves had been overturned, case files spilling onto the carpet. The computer screen was shattered, deep cracks running through the glass like a spiderweb. And on the desk, a single sheet of paper lay untouched in the chaos. James stepped closer. Stop now or you will lose more than your case. His pulse quickened. They had been here, not to steal, not even to find something specific. This was a message. A warning. James clenched his jaw. They wanted him afraid. They wanted him to second-guess every move. But they had miscalculated. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. Maya's voice came from the doorway. James. He turned. She stood there, her phone in her hand, her face tight with concern. I found him. Jonathan Fisk. James grabbed his coat. Where? A small town outside Minneapolis, she said, hurrying to keep up as he walked past her. Retired early. Disappeared from public records right after the case 10 years ago. James didn't need to ask which case. He already knew. Maya hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. He glanced at her. His house caught fire tonight, she said quietly. A few hours ago. James stopped, his hands curled into fists. It was happening again. Marcus, Harper, now Fisk. They were erasing everything. Is he alive? James asked. Maya exhaled. No one knows. James didn't waste another second. Let's go. The drive was long, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts. The highway stretched endlessly, darkened fields on either side, the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. Maya kept glancing at the GPS. It should be just ahead. Minutes later, they turned onto a narrow dirt road, the glow of flames still visible in the distance. The house, or what was left of it, stood in the center of a scorched patch of land. Smoke curled into the night sky, the charred skeleton of the building still smoldering. James stepped out of the car, the heat from the ruins pressing against his skin. A man stood by the edge of the wreckage, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Not a firefighter, a neighbor, maybe. James approached carefully. Did you see what happened? The man turned, his face lined with age, his expression wary. Saw the flames around midnight. Called it in, but by the time help got here, there wasn't much left. Did Fisk make it out? James pressed. The man hesitated, then shook his head. He wasn't here. James's pulse quickened. You're sure? Saw him leave a few nights ago. The man said. Didn't say where he was going. Just packed up and left in the middle of the night. James exchanged a look with Maya. Fisk knew. He had seen it coming. But was he running for his life? Or was he hiding something? James turned back to the man. Do you know where he might have gone? The old man studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the ruins. If he wanted to disappear, he wouldn't have left a trail. James exhaled. Another dead end. But before he could turn away, his phone rang. Blocked number. James hesitated, then answered. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, low, unfamiliar. You're close, the man said, but they're watching. James's grip tightened. Who is this? You don't have much time. The voice continued. Find Fisk before they do. Then the line went dead. James stared at his phone, his mind racing. Someone was still out there. Someone who knew what was happening. And now, it was a race against time. James sat in the dimly lit cafe, his fingers tapping restlessly against the ceramic rim of his untouched coffee. The weight of everything pressed down on him. Fisk was missing. Harper had vanished, and now the only lead he had was the cryptic phone call warning him that time was running out. Across the table, Maya Lopez scrolled through her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's soft glow. She looked up, studying him for a moment before speaking. You look like hell, she said. James exhaled. I feel worse. She leaned in. We need to move. We have the files. We go public. Right now. James nodded. Press conference. Media blast. We put everything out there before they have a chance to bury it. Maya closed her laptop. I'll make the calls. We do this in the morning. Before James could respond, his phone buzzed. A message. He glanced down. Marcus Hill found dead. Apparent suicide. James's stomach dropped. Maya must have seen his expression because her voice sharpened. What is it? James showed her the screen. She went pale. No, she whispered. No way. That's not a suicide. James's jaw tightened. Marcus had known the risks. But he had tried to help anyway. And now he was dead. A message. A warning. Maya gritted her teeth. Reynolds. James didn't need to say it. They both knew. The press conference was already underway when James and Maya arrived at the city hall. But it wasn't theirs. Reynolds had moved first. Cameras flashed. Journalists murmured. And at the podium stood Reynolds. His uniform crisp. His expression solemn. His voice carried through the speakers. Smooth and practiced. It is with great sadness that we confirm the passing of Officer Marcus Hill. A dedicated officer. A friend. A man who, unfortunately, was misled by those who seek to undermine this department. James clenched his fists. Maya muttered under her breath. He's turning this against us. Reynolds continued. Certain individuals have been spreading false accusations against the MPD, manipulating facts, and distorting the truth for personal gain. James felt every eye in the room shift toward him. Reynolds didn't say his name. He didn't have to. And now, Reynolds said, pausing for effect, we have reason to believe that fabricated evidence has been used in an attempt to frame officers of this department. James inhaled sharply. Reynolds gestured toward a man standing to the side. A civilian, late 50s, nervous. Our investigation has led us to a key witness. Reynolds said smoothly, a former forensic analyst who has come forward with proof that certain pieces of evidence, specifically digital files, have been tampered with. The analyst stepped forward, clearing his throat. Based on my examination, there are clear signs of file corruption. This means the data could have been altered. James felt Maya tense beside him. Reynolds turned back to the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at a deliberate effort to discredit this department, and we will not stand for it. James's heart pounded. They had flipped the script. If he released the files now, people would doubt them. They had planted the seed. It was over. Unless. Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Then she froze. James frowned. What? She turned the phone toward him. A video file. No sender. No explanation. Just a title. Reynolds. Night of the incident. James's pulse spiked. Maya played it. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A dimly lit alleyway. Two figures. One of them was Marcus Hill. The other, Mark Reynolds. The audio crackled to life. Marcus's voice was shaky. I did what you asked. No one knows I gave Carter the files. Reynolds's voice was calm, almost amused. That's the problem, Marcus. You actually think this is about files. A pause. Then the gunshot. James's blood ran cold. Maya's hands were shaking. We have him. James swallowed hard, his mind already racing ahead. They had evidence, but would it be enough? No more hesitation, no more waiting. It was time to end this. James barely had time to react. One moment, Maya was standing beside him, talking through their next move. The next, she was gone. The screech of tires, the dull thud of a car door slamming shut. And then, the message. Do you want justice, or do you want her alive? James's breath came fast and shallow as he gripped the phone. His knuckles turning white, his mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. It wasn't random. It wasn't an act of desperation. This was a calculated move. A warning hadn't been enough. A planted story hadn't been enough. Now, they were taking hostages. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. James answered without hesitation. Where is she? A low chuckle on the other end. A voice he knew too well. Reynolds. I warned you, Carter, Reynolds said, his voice calm, almost bored, but you just wouldn't listen. James's grip on the phone tightened. If you hurt her, you'll what? Reynolds cut in. Call the police? Give them more of your doctored evidence? James clenched his jaw. He knew Reynolds was baiting him, trying to shake him. Let her go, James said, forcing his voice to stay even. "This won't stop what's coming." Reynolds let out a small sigh. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about stopping anything. It's about control. Right now, I have it. You don't." James swallowed his anger. "What do you want?" Another pause. Then Reynolds's voice lowered. "Delete the video. Walk away. Do that, and she lives." James closed his eyes briefly, his mind churning. Reynolds thought he had won, but he had just made a mistake. James opened his eyes, his voice steady. "I need proof she's alive." Reynolds hummed as if considering. Then there was movement, rustling fabric, the muffled sound of a struggle. And then Maya's voice, sharp and defiant. "James, don't." The line cut out. James cursed under his breath. Then his phone buzzed again. A different number. He hesitated, then answered. A gravelly voice, older, rough around the edges. "Jonathan Fisk. I know where they're keeping her," Fisk said without preamble. "But if we go in, there's no coming back." James exhaled sharply. "Tell me everything." Fisk met him in an alley behind an old warehouse. His posture tense, eyes scanning the shadows. Up close, the man looked exactly how James had imagined. A ghost of the past, hardened by years of knowing too much. "They've got her in a safe house," Fisk said, wasting no time. "Not a police building. Private property. Means no body cams, no accountability." James's stomach turned. "You're sure?" Fisk nodded. "I've been tracking Reynolds for a long time. He doesn't work alone." James frowned. "You're saying someone's pulling his strings?" Fisk exhaled. "I'm saying Reynolds is a blunt instrument. A useful distraction. But the real power? That's above his pay grade." James's mind reeled. He had suspected there was more to this than one corrupt cop. But hearing it confirmed sent a new wave of unease through him. Fisk studied him. "We don't have time to go after the big players. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting your friend out alive." James nodded. "Agreed." But as he said it, an idea formed in his mind. A way to save Maya. And bring Reynolds down in the process. James pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" Fisk asked. James scrolled through his contacts, found the number he needed, and hit send. A journalist picked up on the first ring. "Check your inbox in 2 hours," James said, his voice firm. "If you don't hear from me by then, release everything." Fisk raised an eyebrow. "You just put a target on your back." James slipped the phone into his pocket, his eyes cold. "Good," he said. "Let's go get her." James tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the darkened highway stretched endlessly before him. The only sounds in the car were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Fisk shifting beside him. They were close now. The coordinates Fisk had pulled led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Minneapolis. It was isolated, far from prying eyes, the kind of place where people disappeared without a trace. James clenched his jaw. They had to move fast. Fisk checked his gun, his expression unreadable. "We go in quiet. We see how many men he's got. Then we act." James nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't a cop. He didn't have years of tactical training. But this wasn't about skill. It was about getting Maya out alive. As the warehouse came into view, James killed the headlights and pulled the car to a stop 100 yards away. They got out, moving low, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Fisk gestured toward a side entrance. "Back doors are best shot." James followed, his pulse pounding in his ears. They slipped through the rusted metal door into the darkened interior. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of oil. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, creating deep pockets of shadows. Somewhere in this place, Maya was being held. Then James heard it, a voice, muffled, strained. "Maya." James tensed, his body moving before his mind could catch up. But Fisk yanked him back, eyes flashing a warning. "Trap," Fisk muttered. James exhaled sharply. He knew Fisk was right. But knowing didn't change the fact that Maya was in there. They moved forward, slow and deliberate, and then the lights snapped on. James barely had time to react before a dozen figures stepped out from the shadows. Weapons raised. The warehouse doors slammed shut. Reynolds stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. James's stomach twisted. They had walked straight into it. Reynolds shook his head as he stepped forward, the overhead lights casting sharp angles on his face. You really don't know when to quit, do you, Carter? James kept his breathing steady, his eyes scanning for Maya. Then he saw her, tied to a chair against the far wall. A bruise forming on her cheek. Her eyes fierce despite the situation. She was alive. That was all that mattered. Reynolds followed his gaze and let out a low chuckle. You think this is going to end the way you want it to? James said nothing. Reynolds took a step closer, lowering his voice. I've seen men like you before. You think a little bit of truth can take down a system built to protect people like me? His eyes darkened. The only thing that happens tonight is you disappearing. Just like Fisk should have. Years ago. Fisk tensed beside James, but he stayed silent. Reynolds sighed. Kill them both. The order was simple, final. James's muscles coiled, ready to fight. And then the sirens rang out. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as blinding red and blue lights flooded through the warehouse windows. Shouts erupted outside. Then the doors burst open. A wave of federal agents poured in, their weapons drawn. Drop your weapons, hands where we can see them. For the first time, James saw something flicker in Reynolds's expression. Surprise. He had been expecting to execute two men in the dark, not to be interrupted by the very system he thought he controlled. The MPD officers with him hesitated. Some immediately raised their hands. Others froze, eyes darting toward Reynolds. Then the chaos began. Shots fired, yelling, bodies moving in every direction. James barely had time to react as Fisk grabbed his arm, yanking him toward cover. Reynolds, meanwhile, was already moving. He wasn't going to fight. He was going to run. James's instincts screamed at him. He couldn't let Reynolds slip away. Fisk must have seen the decision in his eyes. Carter. But James was already moving. Reynolds sprinted toward the side exit, his footsteps echoing in the chaos. James pushed forward, dodging past officers, his breath ragged. He was so close. Then a shot rang out. Reynolds jerked mid-step, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. His body twisted before he crumpled to the ground. James skidded to a stop. A figure stepped from the shadows. Evelyn Harper. She lowered the rifle with precise control, her expression unreadable as she looked down at Reynolds's motionless form. Then she turned to James. You've gone farther than I thought, Carter, she said, voice calm. But this fight isn't over. James swallowed hard, his pulse still racing. Harper tilted her head slightly, as if evaluating him. Then she walked past him, toward the chaos behind them. James exhaled. This wasn't the end, not even close. James sat in Evelyn Harper's office, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the bookshelves lined with legal texts. The scent of old paper mixing with the faint aroma of coffee. Reynolds was dead, but James didn't feel like he had won. Harper sat across from him, her expression unreadable. She leaned back in her chair, fingers laced together as she studied him. Don't celebrate just yet, Carter, she said. Reynolds was a pawn. The people truly in control? They're still out there. James exhaled slowly. Then we bring them down next. Harper raised an eyebrow. You think it's that simple? James didn't answer. He knew nothing about this had been simple. She reached into her desk, pulling out a thin file. I had my people dig into the case from 10 years ago. The one you were chasing. She slid the file toward him. James opened it, scanning the pages. Something inside him went cold. The details had changed. The witness statements were rewritten. The official report now stated that the case had been closed due to insufficient evidence. James clenched his jaw. This was altered. Harper nodded. The moment Reynolds was eliminated, someone higher up cleaned up the mess. You exposed one part of the machine. But the rest of it? It's still running. James closed the file, frustration tightening in his chest. So what now? Harper's expression didn't soften. Now, you decide how far you're willing to go. Maya Lopez's face filled the television screen. The video of Reynolds ordering Marcus Hill's execution had gone public, spreading like wildfire. James watched from a distance as news anchors dissected the footage. Analysts debated what this meant for MPD, and protesters gathered outside City Hall demanding justice. The department responded exactly as he expected. They promised an internal review. They called for patience while the facts were examined. They did everything but admit the truth. It was all theater. James turned away from the screen. He wasn't interested in their performance. He wanted results. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, deep and controlled, spoke. You won a battle, Carter, but the war isn't over. James's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A pause. If you really want to bring the system down, you need to be ready for what's coming. The line went dead. James lowered the phone, his pulse steady. Whoever this was, they were watching. When James arrived at his office, something felt off. The door was unlocked, though he was sure he had locked it before leaving. He stepped inside, his senses on high alert. On his desk sat a thick envelope, unmarked, with no return address. James picked it up carefully and tore it open. Inside was a list of names. Names of officers, prosecutors, judges, names of people within the system. People he had never suspected, connected in ways he hadn't yet understood. James's stomach twisted. Reynolds had been a distraction. The real power lay elsewhere. This fight wasn't over. It had just begun. James Carter sat in the brightly lit television studio, the heat of the stage lights pressing against his skin. Across from him, the anchor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a practiced smile, adjusted his papers. Waiting for the commercial break to end, the red light above the camera flicked on. We're back with attorney James Carter. The anchor announced smoothly. Mr. Carter, after the shocking revelations surrounding the Minneapolis Police Department, what happens now? Is justice being served? James leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. He had rehearsed his answer a dozen times, but the weight of the moment still settled heavy in his chest. Justice, James said, keeping his voice steady, is not just about bringing down one corrupt officer. It's about dismantling a system that allowed him to thrive in the first place. The anchor nodded. And do you believe that's happening? James exhaled. The MPD has promised an internal investigation. Officials are giving speeches about reform. But let's be clear. Words don't mean action. And action doesn't come unless we demand it. The anchor glanced at the screen behind them, where images of protests flashed, crowds chanting, banners raised, signs with Reynolds' name crossed out in bold red ink. There's been speculation, the anchor continued, that higher-ups may have been aware of Reynolds' actions. Do you believe this goes beyond just one man? James hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud made him a target. Finally, he met the anchor's gaze. I don't believe it, James said. I know it. The studio went silent. Even the anchor blinked. James didn't stop. This case isn't about one officer abusing his power. It's about the people who protected him. The ones who let it happen and looked the other way. The anchor cleared his throat. That's a strong accusation. It's not an accusation, James said. It's the truth. And the people of this city deserve to hear it. Later that night, James sat in his apartment, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the darkened room. He should have felt triumphant. He had told the truth on national television. He had forced the system to respond. But something didn't feel right. His inbox chimed. A new email. No subject. No sender. Just a single attachment. James hesitated, then clicked. The video opened to grainy security footage. Silent. Black and white. A conference room. 5 men in suits. A few of them he recognized. One was a city commissioner. Another, a high-ranking prosecutor. The timestamp in the corner was recent. Only days after Reynolds had been exposed. James leaned in as one of the men spoke, though there was no audio. Then, as if anticipating the problem, subtitles appeared. We can't let this get out of control. The first man said, the media will move on soon. Another replied, we just need to hold steady. A third man adjusted his tie. And Carter? The city commissioner leaned forward. We'll deal with him. Quietly. The video ended. James sat frozen. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Maya knocked twice before stepping into his office the next morning. A newspaper tucked under her arm. She tossed it onto his desk. Guess who's on the front page? James glanced down. His own face stared back at him. Right beneath the bold headline. The system is rotten. Attorney James Carter takes on MPD corruption. They're listening, Maya said, and they're scared. James looked back at his laptop screen. The paused video still glowing in the dim light. They should be, he murmured. Maya frowned. What's wrong? James turned the screen toward her. She read the subtitles, her eyes widening. You have to release this. James nodded. I will. But before he could say more, a white envelope caught his eye, sitting neatly on his desk. He hadn't left it there. His pulse quickened as he picked it up. No return address, no markings. Inside, a single sheet of paper. One sentence. Don't think the game is over. We're still watching. James's grip tightened. He glanced toward the window. A black car sat parked across the street. The headlights flicked on. Then, slowly, it pulled away. James exhaled, setting the paper down. If they thought this would scare him, they were wrong. He was just getting started. James Carter sat alone in his office, the weight of the papers in his hands pressing down on him like a stone. The list of names stared back at him. Judges, prosecutors, high-ranking police officials, people he had trusted, people the system had trusted. This wasn't just corruption. This was an empire. Across the desk, Maya Lopez was watching him, arms crossed. We need to release the video, she said. Now. James rubbed his forehead. If we dump it without a plan, they'll bury it, bury us, and no one will care by next week. Maya shook her head. James, you saw what was in that footage. This isn't about just one case. This is about decades of people like Reynolds covering for each other. If we don't act now, they'll wipe everything clean. James met her gaze. She wasn't wrong. He had been fighting this battle long enough to know how the system worked. But if they rushed it, the truth would vanish before it had a chance to matter. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. Evelyn Harper's voice came through, calm and measured. We need to meet. James straightened. You saw the list. I did, Harper said, and I know exactly what's going to happen next. If you want to survive this, we need to be smart. James glanced at Maya. Where? I'll send the location, Harper said. Come alone. Then the line went dead. James drove with his laptop on the passenger seat, a backup hard drive hidden in the glove compartment. He had made copies. He had learned his lesson. As he weaved through the city, headlights flashed behind him. A car, keeping its distance. He tightened his grip on the wheel. Then his dashboard flickered. A notification appeared. Remote access detected. James's pulse spiked. His phone buzzed again. A new text. Your files are gone. James swore under his breath, swiping at his screen. The drive was empty. Every folder, every video, everything was gone. But they didn't know one thing. The real files weren't on his laptop. They were somewhere else. As he neared the meeting point, a dimly lit parking garage, his instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. A truck, parked on the far side of the lot. The engine roared to life. James barely had time to react before it shot forward. Headlights flooded his windshield. The last thing he heard was the sound of metal crumpling as the world flipped upside down. Then, blackness. 6 months later, a journalist at a national newspaper received an anonymous package. No return address. Inside, a single flash drive. The files it contained sent shockwaves through the country. The Minneapolis Police Department, the courts, the prosecutors. A conspiracy spanning decades, exposed in full detail. The public demanded justice. But no one knew who had sent the files. No one knew if James Carter was still alive. In a quiet cafe in another city, a man in dark sunglasses sat at a corner table, a laptop open in front of him. He sipped his coffee, watching the world pass by. On his screen, a single file remained untouched. A folder labeled, Unfinished Justice. He clicked it open, and then he started typing. Justice isn't just about exposing the truth, it's about what comes after. When the system is built to protect itself, bringing one man down isn't enough. The real fight is against those who hide in the shadows, pulling the strings. James Carter learned the hard way that the cost of truth is high. But the question remains, if the system is this corrupt, who will be brave enough to challenge it next? What do you think? Can true justice ever be achieved? Or is the game always rigged? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories uncovering the truths they don't want you to see, subscribe to Covert Truths, because some secrets are too dangerous to stay hidden.